and I'm back to a video of Baldur's Gate 3, real minimum requirement, and the highly requested ACT3. How the budget hardware fare with the newest patches and hotfix, and which hardware can run 720p low smoothly. Welcome to Respawn PC, I'm Dunk, let's dive in. So we start by revisiting the minimum requirement, which is the i5 4690, 8GB of memory, and the GTX 970. But this time we are in Act 3, in part of the city. You request some budget PC testing in Act 3, there it is. I choose that section of the city because I want to test as much as possible every component. So we pass from sunny to shady, to some house that explode in fire, to some sunny again, some dirt treasure finding with a somehow crowded NPC, with more dangerous street view, and finish it with a combat with the steel watch. We're going to do all those tests at 720p low, no FSR. And for the original proposed minimum requirement from Larian Studio, we're reaching an average of 33 to 35 FPS in city. Also try with the 16GB instead of 8GB, and the FPS is barely higher, as you can see on the top right corner. Next up, we have the same setup, 8GB with the GTX 960. We got an average of exact 30 FPS, of some drop here and there when switching from sunny to shady, and also quite a big drop when the explosion happened. But that drop at that explosion house, we'll see drop on every card on that test. And it's not like every house is going to explode in Baldur's Gate. So that 30 FPS for the 960 and 8GB of RAM was a little bit stuttery. So as you can see, I also do the test with 16GB, having a little bit more FPS at 32 on average, but the experience was way more smoother. And that's what we're looking for, smooth. And both 8GB and 16GB during the combat was reaching in the 40 FPS. And when the steel watch explode, both drop in the 20 FPS. And now again for the same system, we have quite a drop, the GTX 950. Not only it's less powerful, it also only have a 2GB VRAM compared to the 960 and the 970. So dropping off of the VRAM, we get a huge drop in the FPS. Now we average at 22, 23 FPS. You can see the same when you also try at the 16GB of memory. The FPS is a bit higher, averaging at the 28, but it's a smoother. I guess you can play if you don't mind giving up a few FPS. Now I'm done with the 8GB of memory because we're going to test a bunch of 2GB cards, and we're currently looking at playing Act 3 smoothly at the lowest budget possible with a mix of proposed minimum requirement and real minimum requirement. And the first card of the lot will be the GT1030, 2GB of DDR5, and at 16GB of memory. This card is struggling. It's not an option to play Baldur's Gate. You can if you want, I won't judge you, but playing at 19 FPS average with a lot of stutter, it's not really enjoyable. Now if we go way holder, GTX 780, and sorry I lied, this card is a 3GB card, not a 2GB. And if you ignore the warning saying that driver is too old for the game and still click play, the game will launch, the game will play, and surprisingly enough, we get an average of 29 to 30 FPS. And for the purpose of being a budget PC builder, I would say this fits the profile of a budget PC playing Baldur's Gate 3 smoothly. That's quite a surprise. I didn't thought that card of that age would be able to play in Act 3. Then, still in the 700 series, the 750 Ti 2GB DDR5. This one had support for driver longer than the 780. And other than that, the 780 is better than the 750 Ti on every aspect. The GPU is pegged mostly at 100%, but we get an average of 28 FPS, which from my point of view, it's quite playable and quite surprising. I wasn't expecting that, but let's see if we go holder, still 2GB. Next up, we go even holder, GTX960. This is still a 2GB card. You'll have to click on the driver warning to start the game, like the GTX 780. It was playable, still quite smooth enough to be playable, and I guess if you want an extreme budget, that card can fit. But keep in mind, I'm playing currently with a fresh install of Windows, no bloatware, and only the basic Windows telemetry from a regular install. Driver update, Steam install, Baldur's Gate install. That's the only thing is running right now. Now for the fun of it, I decided to try the GTX 570. that is old and only have 1.2 gigabit of memory. The game launched, there's no doubt about it, but the FPS was in the teens, 16 to 19s. It's funny that it's still, I don't know if I can say playable, but it's launchable. It's funny to see the 570 giving similar result as the GT1030, but a bit smoother. For the AMD side, the things of GPUs, I only had two that I can test. There's this one, the R9 380. This is a 4 gigabit card, but I had a hard time to get a stable FPS. It was smooth enough to be considered playable, but the range was from 14 FPS to 45 FPS, to ultimately giving me an average of 29. The other AMD card I have is the RX 560. The 4 gigabit variant, but also the lower performing one. Even though the card got 4 gigabyte of memory, of a VRAM, it was struggling on every part. Averaging 22 FPS, I get lows at 4 to 7 FPS. This card, even with this 4 gigabyte of VRAM, is not playable by any means or any person. Now, after doing some tests with this i5 4th gen CPU, let's try a 3rd gen i7. We're going to pass from 4 core 4 thread to 4 core 8 thread and running at 3.4 GHz instead of 3.5. So does the number of core will make a difference? We start back with the GTX970 and I go straight to the 16 gigabit of memory. We got almost no difference in FPS compared to the i5 4th gen. We are averaging at 34 FPS compared to 33 FPS. My guess is we're going to see similar results during the whole test, but we're going to compare it anyway because you asked for it. After that, it was the GT1030 2GB DDR5. I got a better FPS at 22 instead of 19, but it's still barely playable. So far the 1030 is a no-go, regardless of the CPU. It's laggy, it's stuttery, it's a mess. Anyway, there's more budget card than the 1030 and give you a better result than the 1030. Next up is the GTX960 with the i5 4690 and 16GB of memory. It gave us 32 FPS and we have the exact same result here, 32 FPS. So we don't have any difference with those two CPU with the same GPU. My guess is when we reach lower performing card, we're going to have the 3770 shine a little bit more, but who knows? Let's continue our adventure. Then next up, we have the GTX950, again dropping 2 GB of VRAM on the GPU, make a huge difference in FPS. We now at 28 FPS, the same result as the i5 4690. So far, 2-3 card, same result. Only big difference I can see is the 3770, make it a bit less stuttery. Next up is the big old GTX970 for 3 GB card that run better than the R9 380 or the RX 560. Still run quite good with that CPU also. And surprisingly, average at 29 FPS while the i5 was averaging at 30 FPS. We're really stretching the life of those old cards. Then we get the quite old but still widely used GPU, the GTX970 Ti. Again, if we compare to the i5 4690, we actually lost 2 FPS. We had 26 with this i7 and we were at 28 with the i5. I'm surprised. I thought we were going to get more performance from the CPU when we reach older and less performing GPU. It is still playable, quite still smooth also. And now for fun again, the GTX960 2GB got an average of 26 FPS, just over the i5 4690, which had an average of 24 FPS. We're not at 30 FPS, but it's smooth enough that I can consider that playable. That is also the minimum proposed card for Diablo 4. So if you have that card, you have 2 AAA of 2023 that you can play. And the last card for Nvidia will be the GTX 570. That 1.2 GB card can manage 18 FPS. I would say this is barely playable, if at all. I mean, if you're in extreme budget and you absolutely want to play that game, okay, I guess. I hope you have a fresh install of Windows and nothing else on that computer. For the AMD card, the R9 380 with 4 GB of VRAM was managing at 26 FPS, 3 FPS less than with the i5 4690. And the driver is clearly not optimized to that AMD card. There's quite a bit of stutter it's a bit laggy and the drops are quite high. At 26 FPS, the GTX 750 Ti or the GTX 660 are also at 26 FPS but are smoother gameplay. And to finish this up, it will be the RX 560 4GB. I got a little bit higher FPS at 24 instead of 22 with the i5, but the FPS was unstable, fluctuating really high and low, so this card is mostly a no-go. Then I tried lowering the CPU, going to a i5 2500, kept the 16GB of memory, and back to the minimum proposed requirement of the GTX 970. The i7 3770 and the i5 4690 was already somehow a bottleneck for the GTX 970. We know the card can run the game, but the CPU cannot. Getting an average of a playable 29 FPS, and that is when you put into account that moving in city you at 18, 19 FPS, but while you stand still in combat, you reach a 30, 35 FPS. I mean, it's playable if you just want to enjoy combat, but moving around the city is a real pain. And since I already have my second gen platform out, I decided to try the i3 2100 with 16GB and the GTX 970. The GPU is so bottleneck, it's only using 23% of its power, averaging the game at 18 FPS. So my guess for this game, the real lowest CPU, it would be a 3rd gen i7 or a 4th gen i5. Then I decided for comparison to put my main rig to the same test, which is a laptop with a Ryzen 7 4800H and a GTX 1660 Ti with 16GB of RAM. I'm currently playing the game at 1080p high with some custom settings that I found optimized for my laptop. I'm currently averaging a 38 FPS in ACT3 at 1080p high. It plays smoothly enough to keep that FPS without dropping any other settings. But for the fun of it, I've tried 720p low with my setup. Visual quality dropped, but the FPS raised to 45. But I don't need that 6 more FPS. I better have better visual. And here you have it, the list of winner of ACT3 for 720p low to play smoothly on a budget with all the CPU that could go in between. And if you have a younger CPU than a 3rd gen or 4th gen, the GTX 970 and 960 was sometimes bottlenecked by the CPU, so you may be able to get high resolution or higher settings. Keep in mind that all those tests was done on a fresh install of Windows without any bloatware. Hopefully this video helped answer a lot of questions that you had on ACT3. Thanks to have come watching and subscribe.